So happy to be here with y'all and to welcome y'all in. We're going to get started in just a little bit, talking about David Dylan Thomas's new book, Design for Cognitive Bias. But first, let's get some of the intro things out of the way, some of the business of Black UX Austin. My name is Crystal Paull. I am one of the leaders on the BUXA team here. And so I'm going to move forward here. Here's the rest of the leadership team. We've got Carmen. I think we might all be on this call today. Carmen Broomes, Dr. Lisanne Norman, Sarah Overton, myself, Treavor Wagoner, Arlin William. We're so happy to be here again, like I said, with you guys. We're going to be planning more events coming up. We're currently in that planning mode at this moment. Once we know what those events will be, we'll let you guys know through our various channels. If you're in our Slack space or safe space, we'll let you know there. If you're looking for just to learn a little bit more about us, you can email us at blackuxaustin@gmail.com. We also have a LinkedIn company that you can follow. And we're also on Instagram at blackuxaustin. And a little bit about us. We're a space for people of African ancestry who may also identify as Black to meet other Black user experience professionals in Austin in order to build a community and a thriving network. Our allies are also welcomed, especially to events like these. So I think I'm going to pass this off now that we've got some of the business out of the way to Dr. Lisanne Norman, who is going to introduce our speaker today, the esteemed David Dylan Thomas. Go ahead, Lisanne.
Thanks, Crystal. Good evening, everyone. We're so excited to see so many of you here and to have you here for this amazing talk. I just want to intro David Dylan Thomas. So many of us in UX practice have become familiar with his work over the years because it's such a timely topic, but it's something that we should all sort of be considering to become a principle in the UX praxis that we all practice, as well as, to talk to others about it, to think of it in terms of anything we create, to think about how do we, mitigate the bias? How do we make products that are more inclusive? So a little bit about David. David serves as the content strategy advocate at experience design firm Think Company and is the creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast. He's developed digital strategies for major clients in entertainment, healthcare, publishing, finance, and retail. He's presented at a number of conferences, as you can see here, TEDx New York City, South by Southwest, Confab, An Event Apart, LavaCon, UX Copenhagen, and that one is on YouTube, and you definitely should check that out. That was definitely one of my favorites. He's also presented at Artifact, IA Conference, Design and Content Conference, and the Wharton Web Conference on topics at the intersection of bias, design, and social justice. We are so excited to welcome you here to our group tonight. I can't wait to hear your talk, and everyone keep in mind that we are also going to be doing a raffle of 2 of David's book, Design for Cognitive Bias. So, for everyone here at the end of the event, we'll announce the winners and then we'll ask that you stay on. But without further ado, I'm going to cede the floor to David. Let's give him all a really warm welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And first, I'll share my screen, then we'll get started. So thank you all for coming. This is Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. And my name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm a content strategy advocate at Think Company, and I wrote a book called Design for Cognitive Bias. Now, the road to this book began with a podcast I do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to the podcast began with this woman. Her name is Iris Bonnet, and she gave a talk once called Gender Equality by Design, which is amazing. You should check it out on YouTube. And one of the points she brings up is that a lot of implicit gender and racial bias basically comes back to pattern recognition. And so imagine you're hiring a web developer, right? And the first image that might pop into your brain when I say the words web developer might be skinny white dude. Right. And it's not because you actually think men are better programmers than women, but the image that's been built up in your head over time in the pattern that you've gotten from movies or television, or maybe even offices you've worked in, makes that equation. So if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that, all of a sudden you're giving that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could come back to something as simple and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is a list of cognitive biases from the Rational Wiki. There's well over 100 here, and I realized I am not going to figure this out in a day, so I just took one a day, and the next day I'd move on to the next one. And this turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. So my friend said, basically, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now, it's worth establishing from the jump what is cognitive bias. And at the end of the day, it's just a series of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions a day. Right now, I'm even making decisions about how fast to talk or what to do with my hands or where to look. If I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that most of our lives are spent on autopilot. Every now and then the autopilot gets it wrong, and we call those errors cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you are playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. If you need a low number, you tend to roll it really gently. And we all know it makes no difference how hard you roll the die. But in situations where we have no control, we like to feel like we have control. And so we embody that desire by how hard we roll the die. This one is not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And it happens when you get an idea stuck in your head and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't support the idea, you say fake news and you move on. An excellent example of this came during the Iraq War. The whole idea was we had to go in there because Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and we had to get him before he got us. Now, within a year, the president of the United States, who had been insisting there were weapons of mass destruction there, said, yeah, we didn't find anything. Regardless, many people still believed there were weapons of mass destruction there. So many that even if you fast forward 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and 30% of Democrats still believe there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Even today, right, I can tell you with a certain degree of confidence that 14 years from now, there will absolutely be a lot of people who believe that Trump won the election. So this is a very powerful bias, and we will be coming back to it. So these biases are really tough to fight. Part of the problem is you may not even realize you have the bias. There's literally a bias called the bias blind spot, where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. Part of the problem is about 95% of cognition happens below the threshold of conscious thought, right? You're making these decisions so fast, you don't even realize you've made them. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, you'll probably still do it. There's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could have everybody on this call write down the last 2 numbers of their phone number. And I could say, okay, that's great. Now we're going to bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down a lower number are likely to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down a higher number are likely to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. But here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we did the experiment. You'd still do it. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to do that thing. You'd still do it. So the reason we need to care about cognitive bias as designers is because of a thing called choice architecture, right? And you can see this play out when you go buy produce, right? And the common wisdom is you don't reach for the top of the barrel because that's where the grocer's going to put the product they're most trying to move, the old product. They've architected that situation to benefit themselves. Now, they could have just as easily architected it to benefit the customer by putting the freshest fruit where it's easiest to reach. But the point is, however that situation is architected, it will influence the decisions you make when you're in the experience. So think about the decisions your users need to make. Now think about how people make decisions, not how we think they make decisions like rational human beings. No, how someone who's making 95% of their decisions so fast they don't even realize it. How are they making decisions? And there are, in fact, content and design choices that we can make to help keep some of these biases at bay, or maybe even sometimes use them for good. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. let's go back to the skinny white dude. As it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have two identical resumes and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it's a male sounding name, it tends to keep going through the chain. If it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay on the pile. Thing is, why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, decide who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem. The signal, the thing that's actually helping you make the decision, are things like the qualifications, the experience. What might actually be getting in the way, based on patterns that you may have seen throughout your life, might be things like gender and race, or really what you're reading into the name in terms of gender or race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position, and they discovered a couple things pretty quickly. First, the best way to anonymize a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, is to have an intern with no stake in the process physically print out the resume, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. The next thing they discovered is that they might find a developer resume they liked, and their next instinct would be to go to GitHub to see that developer's portfolio. But the second they got to GitHub, guess what happened, right? As soon as the profile loaded, all the personal information was there and it ruined the experiment. So clever people that they are, they wrote a Chrome plugin that would anonymize all that content as it loaded. And then just to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. This isn't just about helping humans make hiring decisions. Amazon created a hiring bot that was basically there to help filter through resumes. And they discovered pretty quickly that it was extremely sexist. So sexist that if it even saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade that resume. So when they tried to figure out how did it become so sexist, they asked themselves, well, how do we train this AI? Well, they trained it on the last 10 years of resumes to Amazon. Guess what most of those resumes had in common? It's mostly guys. And so the AI took one look at that, said, oh, geez, sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. We like to think that AI is this sort of cold, rational, objective machine, when in fact, it's basically a glorified prediction engine. And if you point it at a racist, sexist world, it will make racist, sexist predictions. I'm of the opinion that we should really start lying to AI just to get more objective results. But this can go in the reverse, right? Amazon Go is a store where you just walk in, take what you want, and leave. And Amazon is going to auto-magically deduct whatever you've taken from your account. Now, this had a really curious effect for Ashley Clark Thompson, who wrote an article for CNET called "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." And what she's referring to is the experience of shopping while Black. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's basically like hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? When she went to Amazon Go, there was no one there to do that. By eliminating one key design element, namely the staff, Amazon created a less biased experience for this customer. We're even seeing this play out in the judicial system. In San Francisco, they've been trying out blind charging. The idea is that district attorneys have incredible leeway when it comes to deciding whether or not to bring charges when a crime has been committed. Perhaps not surprisingly, they tend to do this more often when it's a Black offender than when it's a white offender for the same crime. So just like the resumes, they said, well, why do you even need that information when you're looking at the crime report? So they started producing crime reports that left out the gender and race of the offender and the gender and race of the victim, and even the location of the crime to try to get less biased results out of the DA. Another really important concept to understand in terms of UX is cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I will assume whatever it's talking about is also easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about is also going to be hard to do. I have been making a lot of pancakes lately. This is a recipe for pancakes, and the text is kind of small and clumped together. And I might glance at that and think, I don't know, pancakes, I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm gonna make pancakes. Now I can take that same text and give it nice full width imagery and break it out into smaller chunks of text. And I might glance at that and say, you know what? I bet I can make pancakes. Let's make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now think about that same logic if I'm trying to decide whether to drive or take public transportation. If I take one look at that printed schedule, I will conclude very quickly that public transportation is impossible and there's no way I'm going to use it. By the same token, I could glance at that app screen, and before I even read a word of it, I might assume, you know what, I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't see any of your faces, so I'm just going to ask you to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913. But the point is, most people usually pick 1914. The reason being, if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what's happening here is that we like things that are easy to process. One thing that I've learned by looking at bias after bias after bias is that they're all shortcuts to certainty. We love certainty and we hate uncertainty. So if we can do any kind of logical backflips to get to certainty, we'll do it. Things that are easy, things that rhyme, things that are easier to read, things that are easier to process feel more certain. Now I'll give you an example. Let's say I asked you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? Did you get a toy truck, right? You might not really be certain about that answer. It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. If I said, what did you have for breakfast this morning? That answer might pop right into your head. You'd feel really certain about it. It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. Feels really certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember. They feel more certain. Things that have plain language and big, bold fonts, right? And pictograms, right? They're easier to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when it comes to things we need to believe. There is a crisis in this country where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In a 2002 survey, when given the statement the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only about 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole talk about why there are legit reasons African Americans have concerns about health information that comes from the government. But the fact is, information could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor very wisely challenged me and said, okay, that is interesting in theory, but can you actually point to instances where plain language and pictograms have saved lives? And I'm glad she did, because it forced me to do the work and actually find some interesting results. So this is a situation where you had women who were smoking while pregnant, and when they were given materials right at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they were more likely to stop smoking while pregnant and even 6 weeks postpartum. By the same token, if you have caregivers, people who are helping other people take their medicine, if they were given a plain language pictogram-based intervention, they saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking their medicine. Now, you might think that's great for pictograms and plain language, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. A while ago, a whole bunch of states rolled out legislation that said if you don't buckle your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did pretty good, right? Especially among older drivers, but not as much among younger drivers, right? So they rolled out click it or ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. And just to put that in more human terms, for every percentage point you go up in people actually buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So doing the rough math, that's about 4,000 lives saved, in part through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. The whole easy to process thing even applies to names. So there is a name pronunciation effect, where if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture that you're in, you tend to do better. And this affects things like voting preferences and occupational status. Now, with the caveat that easy to pronounce is a culturally sensitive thing, right? So in some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce, in other cultures, Mbimo is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture you're in, you kind of got it made. They actually looked at law firms. And the higher up you went in the hierarchy in the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks, right? If you have an IPO, you have a stock that's opening, and the name of the stock is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. In fact, if even that little stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. We will lay real money down on things that are easier to process. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out pretty innocently. So imagine you go to the store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And next to it, there's a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people will gravitate toward? It's the same thing, right? But I've framed one of them in a way that makes it seem more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef. But what if I said, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? We're no longer talking about if it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you are multilingual, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you're less likely to fall for the scam. Now, I speak a little bit of French. So if I try to think about the beef decision in French, it would go something like, let's see, beef, that's bœuf, that's a lot of vowels. It's 95%, that's 89, maybe? Right, by the time I've done all that processing, I see right through the scam. And that's the point. I've slowed down my thinking. The foundational work on all of this is by a guy named Daniel Kahneman. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the point he makes is that we have these two systems of thinking, and one of them moves very quickly. And that's where all these biases live when we're thinking too fast, we're under pressure. When we use the system that's for doing like really hard math problems, right, that you can't do quickly, that slowed down version of thinking is much less susceptible to these biases. Now, as it turns out, you can actually use the framing effect for good. So there's an experiment where you have an audience and you show them a photo like this and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you'll get is a policy discussion, right? Some people will say, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And other people will say, how dare you, that's ageist, people should do what they want, right? All you're gonna learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you can show the same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you'll get is basically a design discussion, right? Some people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we change the height of the dashboard? Right? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several ways that person might be able to drive that car. All I did was change like 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I iris out a little more and I ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the guy was in the car in the first place. He was here, but he wanted to be there. And if I frame it that way, all of a sudden things like public transportation are on the table. You can even see this play out in school, right, in college. One place where, again, women are historically disadvantaged is in student evaluations of teachers. Students tend to evaluate their female professors lower than their male counterparts for the exact same course. So Iowa State University decided to do an experiment where they gave some of the students a couple paragraphs before they filled out the survey that basically said just that. Hey, here's an area where women and minorities are generally disadvantaged. When you are making your evaluation, please make sure you're using real criteria and not things like appearance. The students who got those 2 paragraphs tended to rate their female professors higher than the students who did not. I'm going to close by talking about our biases because these are the ones that can actually get our users in trouble. A really important one to understand is notational bias. And you can see this play out in sheet music. So I grew up playing saxophone and I had to learn how to read music like this. And I came to understand that any music in the world could be written like this and then I could play it. As it turns out, I found out, I don't know, 40 years later, that's actually not true at all. There is a lot of Asian music, a lot of African music for which this notation system is totally inadequate. It just doesn't work. And if you make this the default, it is remarkably easy to erase lots of culture. Now, we see this more in our day-to-day when we're asking people for personal information, right? And if I have it in my head that there is only 2 genders and I write my forms that way, I'm going to eradicate any number of identities. By the way, while we're on the topic of asking for personal information, you should know about the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is where if something goes well, that's my fault. And if something goes poorly, that's your fault. you may have run into this bias in your life. And it plays out for computers too, right? If I'm doing something on a computer and something goes wrong, I'll blame the computer. And if something goes right, I'll blame me. Unless I've given the computer a lot of personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more likely I am to blame the computer if something goes right and myself if something goes wrong. So we need to be very thoughtful how often we really ask for personal information, because the more we do it, the more we're engendering a potentially toxic relationship between people and their technology. This also plays out in structured content. It still breaks my heart to say this. Until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. And the way that would work is the first mention of a woman's name in an article, you would say her full name. And then every mention after that, you would either say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. And the pattern this would set up, and remember how important patterns are, the pattern this would set up is that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, and then maybe her last name. Now imagine that in article after article after article for over 100 years. We need to be very careful how we structure our content and the kind of editorial guidelines we create, because they are an easy way to scale bias. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. Take a look at Vice President Dick Cheney back in the day, basically trying to figure out what he can get away with. So he talks to his lawyers and they tell him, look, you are the vice president, which means you are a member of the executive branch. But you also cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you are also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be both part of the executive branch and part of the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, well, then maybe you don't need to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. Now we see the same thing play out today with software like Facebook, where when it suits them, Facebook says, hey, we're a publisher. Hey, New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. When someone points out there are rules for publishers, it's all, whoa, I don't know what you heard, buddy. We are a platform. Now, there are tools out there that can help us think about how to write more inclusively. One of them is Radical Copy Editor, and it's very good for helping you understand how to write about people who don't usually get a lot of say in how they're written about. Textio is another good one that is really good with job descriptions, right? Inclusive job descriptions, because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. Another term to get familiar with is evidentiality, right? So it's something that English doesn't really have, but some other languages do. And it has to do with the verb tense. So the way English uses verb tense is mostly to tell you when something happened. So Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. Other languages like Turkish have their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting. So it's there to tell you how I know that Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for, I personally saw Bob go to the store. And there's a whole other verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store. And then a whole other verb tense for, I don't know, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. The point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know that Bob went to the store. Now imagine how this would affect what people were willing to post or what people were willing to say in a speech if they literally couldn't say it without also saying how they knew it to be true. Now, English doesn't have this as a mandatory feature, but as designers, I think we can get creative about how to introduce it. So remember I said that if something is easier to read, it feels more true. Well, by the same token, if something is harder to read, it feels a little less true. Now, this is an actual article from when the first trailer dropped for the new 007 movie. And the first paragraph is basically confirmable information, right? This is the name of the film. This is who's in it. The second paragraph is a rumor about why the first director got fired. The first paragraph, fairly easy to read, fairly easy to believe. The second paragraph, a little harder to read, a little harder to believe, and it should be, it's a rumor. So I think we can start to get creative with how we might signal to our users just how believable different pieces of content might actually be. Told you we'd come back to this. So for a very long time, I had a complete misunderstanding of the scientific method. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I am going to test that idea. And if I'm right, I'm going to write down everything that I did, and a whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. And if they get the same result, yay, write it down. It's a law. Move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it is not that simple. It's more like I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I'll write down what I did. A whole bunch of other people will try the same thing. If they get a good result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. That is a much more rigorous approach, and it was invented specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, it is remarkably easy for us to leave good design on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with the computer. And the game is the computer shows us those numbers and a question mark and says, hey, put whatever number you want where the question mark is, and I will tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. Now, if you're like me, you try 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that number fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, nah, hold my beer, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution, probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build. But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid these outcomes. One of them is used by both the military and journalists, which I love saying, because how many things can you say that about? But it's called red team, blue team. And the idea is that you have a blue team who's going to do the initial research, maybe get as far as a wireframe. But before they go any further, the red team is going to come in for one day, and they're going to basically go to war with the blue team. And they're there to figure out every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their initial idea. Now, I like this approach because it's fairly economical. I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, from now on, we've got to hire 2 teams for every single project, and they got to check each other's work every day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. Now, another thing I like about this approach is that it highlights the value of an outside perspective. This is Norman Ohler. He wrote a book called Blitzed, which is about Nazis on drugs. And the way it began is his friend, who's a DJ, said that when he was growing up in Berlin, all the World War II vets would tell him about how they used to be on drugs all the time. And Norman believes his DJ friend, takes him at his word and says, let me look into this. And sure enough, the Nazis kept meticulous records. Here's what they were giving the soldiers. It was basically meth. Here's what they were giving Hitler. It was basically oxy. And here's what they were giving the German populace at the time, right? Now, this was new findings, new research. And it's not because people haven't really been looking closely at World War II. There is, a lot of historians' works around this particular conflict. But my theory is that the Venn diagram of historians and people who are familiar with recreational drug use is fairly slim. And had the DJ friend gone up to some historian and said, hey, did you know the Nazis were on drugs? That historian would very likely say, okay, whatever, junkie, you go on your merry way. But Norman, who also is familiar with recreational drug use, took his friend at his word. The point is, if you were to ask me, hey, Dave, we're writing a book about World War II, who should we talk to? I probably wouldn't say a German DJ, but it would be a fantastic answer. So we need to get used to the idea of getting outside of our shell when it comes to the inputs for our design. Now, another critical factor in doing this kind of work is being able to think about the unhappy path. And it's difficult for us because as designers, we sell the happy path. Hey, we're going to make your website work so much better. Hey, we're going to make your product work so much easier and make it more intuitive. We're going to create this wonderful happy path. The problem with that is there are far more unhappy paths for any interaction than there are happy paths. So we should be spending at least as much time thinking about those. There is a bias, however, that gets in the way of that, and it's called survivorship bias. And a great story about it is this guy, Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald was a brilliant Austrian mathematician. But he was also a Jew living in Austria in the 1930s, which meant he had to get out. And he did, fortunately. He made it to the States. And when he got there, the army asked him to help him out with their planes. Basically, their planes kept getting shot down. And they had invited all these scientists, including him, to come and try to figure out where should we put more armament on these planes to keep them from getting shot down so much. And the rest of the scientists in the room were looking at all these planes with all these bullet holes. And they said, okay, well, you see these bullet holes? Well, obviously, that's where you should put more armament. And Abraham took one look at that and said, actually, no, you should be putting it exactly where you don't see bullet holes. Because what Abraham realized was they were looking at the survivors. They were looking at the planes that got shot up, but not so bad that they couldn't make it back. What they needed to worry about is the planes that got shot up so bad that they went down. And clearly those planes were shot where these planes were not. So when we're just looking at the survivors and not thinking about the things that didn't work, we can make bad choices. A really good tool for thinking about that unhappy path is called speculative design. And it's a lot like that show Black Mirror, which if you haven't seen it is basically a Twilight Zone for tech. You take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if real normal human beings got their hands on it. And it's always terrible. I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. So this is a real job. The folks at Superflex went down to the United Arab Emirates, and they were there to basically help them think about the future of energy. And the question on the table was, do we stay on the road of fossil fuels, or do we start investing in renewables? So one of the things that Superflex did was to basically figure out, okay, what is your air quality going to be like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years if you keep doing fossil fuels? But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it, and then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to 10 years out, it is unbreathable. So at the end of that engagement, the United Arab Emirates announced they were going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Another great thing to do to kind of get all your biases out on the table at the beginning of a project, it's called an assumption audit. And the idea is that you get your team in a room before you even kick off, and you ask these 5 questions. 1, what identities does your team represent? Now, you only self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're thinking about things like gender or age or income or neurodiversity. And then you're going to ask, how might those identities influence the design of this particular experience? And then you ask, okay, who's not in this room, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned, right? And then you ask, how might the absence of that perspective influence the outcome of this thing that we're working on? And finally, you ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those voices in this process? And I choose those words very carefully, right? Include, certainly talk to people, honor, maybe pay them for their time, give power, right? Are there people involved who are going to be affected by the thing we're designing who have absolutely no say in the design? And how can we give them more say? Because they're going to have to live with the thing we build. Now, a really cool example of this, I don't know how many of you are Mandalorian fans, but the show Mandalorian has this alien race of creatures who use a lot of basically sign in their language. And when they were planning the episode, one of the folks there spoke ASL and had a friend who was actually deaf and said, why don't we actually hire him to be one of the sand people, one of these aliens? And they did. And it ended up making the show that much richer. But what happened was he sat in the room, saw who wasn't in the room, and figured out a reason for them to be there. So a really great way to think about answering that question, like who's not in the room and who should we invite to be in the room, is called participatory design. And it's basically a way of thinking about power when you do design. And one of the first things you do is called a power map. And it's basically a graph of who has very little power in this design process and who has a lot of power. And the other axis is who has low interest or low impact, basically, who's not going to be really all that impacted and not interested, and who's actually going to be very impacted and is very interested in the outcome of this, right? So if you think about the example of working with the Office of Homeless Services in your city, this is based on a true story. The people, let's say you're redoing the intake design of that particular office, right? The people who are going to be most impacted by your work but really have the least say are going to be the people experiencing homelessness. And just a little bit up from that, right, might be the frontline staff who are actually helping people who are experiencing homelessness, right? So what you want to do in participatory design, once you've identified those folks, is to pull the people who are in that lower quadrant, who have very little power but are very impacted, and figure out how am I going to put them in that higher level where they have a lot of impact, but also a lot of power. And that involves things like not just doing research with them once and then saying, okay, thanks for your time. No, you're going to come back when you synthesize that research and say, hey, did we get this right? or you're going to come back and design with them. And before you finish the design, you're going to say, hey, did we get this right? And before you actually implement, right, what you design, you're going to come back to them and say, hey, did we get this right? And again, the reason you're going to do that is because they have to live with the thing you design. Now, the final bias I want to talk about is called the déformation professionnelle. And it happens when you really only see the world through the lens of your job. And in the workaholic world a lot of us live in, that might seem like a good idea, right up until it isn't. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting really difficult to get shots that were going to fetch them a really high price. What they were not doing such a good job of was being human beings. Now, the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey, when he took the job, he asked his officers one question: what do you think your job is? And many of them answered to enforce the law. And he would say, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you your job is to protect civil rights? Now, that is that encompasses enforcing the law, right? But it's a much bigger job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I have had this slide in here since 2017, and I won't lie, it's been harder to talk about this slide in the past year. I think harder still tonight talking with a lot of Black folks. This is a hard slide to look at, but I keep it in here because now more than ever, it is clear how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Now, Ramsey was telling his officers that their jobs were harder than they think. And I'm here to tell us our jobs are harder than we think. It's not just design cool shit. We have to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, some people are already working on this, right? You have Mike Montero out at Mule Design, who's created a design ethics booklet, which is basically like a Hippocratic oath for designers, first do no harm. And it's full of wisdom like, hey, a designer is first and foremost a human being. There's the Design Justice Network, which is doing amazing work in this area. And they have this list of 10 principles. I'm just going to read you the first 2. We use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcome of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to those first 2, you have got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when in fact we're doing the latter. The good news, the reason I kind of actually get excited when I talk about this stuff is that the solutions, the tools for actually doing this better have been around for a while. We don't have to invent them from scratch. The Marcula Center for Applied Ethics does a really good job of taking literally thousands of years of ethics, right? People have been studying moral philosophy for thousands of years and coming up with frameworks and ways of tackling these tough questions. We just need to take advantage of them, right? So questions you might ask about your product: which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's the virtue approach, right? These tools have been here for millennia. It's time to start using them. Another great intervention for this is called the Tarot Cards of Tech. And it's basically this website you go to, and there are these cards, and you click them and they flip around, and they give these really provocative questions about what you're working on. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, we might be living in a very different world today. We also see software engineers getting in on this, right? So you have the Never Again pledge, which came about when a lot of data engineers were being asked to use their data in ways that would harm immigrants. And they pointed to a very long history of data being used to hurt excluded populations. And they said, we don't want to be a part of that history. And here's a list of things we will do to avoid that happening, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. And we're seeing this kind of collective action play out at places like Google, where you have Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And a lot of software engineers got together and said, look, we didn't get into this business to make weapons. If you make us work on this, we're leaving. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million contract with the military, and then turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is a censored search in China thing. So that battle is still going on. But even very recently, in the past few weeks, I know Google has basically started to unionize. They're starting to see real union action over at Google, which is unprecedented. If you are thinking, okay, I want to fight the good fight. I want my work to be more inclusive. I want my shop to be more inclusive, but I don't know where to start. A good thing to think about is consistency bias. So I can tell you where I am. We're trying to roll out more inclusive design. And we were faced with a choice. We could either do like a big, giant, form a committee, an inclusive design committee, and we'll have lots of meetings, and we'll completely reinvent the design process where we work and come up with a plan. And in a year, we'll have a brand new, blah, blah, blah. And I know from experience that that's the most likely outcome of that is a meeting engine. So we decided to take a different approach. And it's a bit more incremental to say, okay, what's one thing that we could do differently? One thing that would affect the design process, but wouldn't require a huge overhaul. So we decided to start with that assumption audit I was telling you about. And that is, now I can go to our COO and say, hey, for the next couple of projects, I'd like us to do an assumption audit. And these are like 600-hour projects. I only need 2 hours. Assumption audit meeting takes maybe 2 hours. Can I just get those 2 hours? That's it? Okay, great. Later on, after we've done a few projects that way, I can come back and say, you know what? I'd like to do a red team. Now that's going to take a day, but this project's going to go on for 90 days. Let me just get 1 day. And my COO is much more likely to say yes to that than if I were to say, hey, let's overhaul the entire process. And part of the reason is because of consistency bias. So a real experiment in consistency bias is this. I come up to you and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're going to say no, right? But if I say, hey, can I put this, you're not even going to notice it. Just this little itty bitty, can I put this on? You're more likely to say yes. If I come back 2 weeks later and then say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes, because now you're sign people, right? We like to be consistent with our former decisions. So with the design firm, if I go up and say, hey, can I just get this little 2 hours, just this little 2 hour meeting and put it on a few projects? And they say yes. And I come back 3-4 projects later and say, hey, can I get like a day for a red team? Can I just get, oh, they're going to say yes, because, well, I guess we're inclusive design people now. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines, computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how might we define our jobs in a way that lets us be more human to each other? Thank you.
Thank you, David, by the way, for that presentation. I learned even more. All right. So we did have some questions.
I'm going to start with a question that I had for you. David, after listening to your talk and seeing, your TED Talks and the other talks, you said, and I love this, right? You said, you want to train AI on the much less racist and sexist world we want. And I love that idea. What I got to thinking was the how, right? Like on a practical level, how do you imagine this actually happening, right? Like what does this look like, right? How would somebody comes to you and go, okay, Dave, we love this. Yes, tell us how to do this. What would you say?
So what I would say is, so let's go back to the actual Amazon example, right? So the first thing we would need to do, and this is just, I'm a content strategist, so I'm always going to say this, what's the goal, right? So if we look at that sexist AI, and its goal was to recommend new people to hire, that's a terrible goal for that AI, for the data that we're giving it. If the goal was, we want to know how biased our hiring process is, okay, that would be a great task for that AI. Because when it suddenly only recommends men, you're like, oh, okay, we have a problem with our hiring process. So if you wanted to come back and say, hey, we want to program this AI so that's going to be more fair and more equitable in its hiring, I would say, okay, if that's the case, think about the results you're kind of looking for here. I would recommend a few things. I would say, think about how you're training it. Don't train it on the resumes you already have, because then you're just going to get the same thing. Like, why would you think you'd get new results from old data? Instead, I'd say, okay, I want you to weight the results the AI is giving back to you, and I want you to have it start looking at HBCUs. And I want you to start looking at women's colleges specifically and programs that focus on, underprivileged youth and all this stuff. Basically, if you want a more diverse group, look where the more diverse people are, right? Like these organizations have existed to support people who are excluded for a very long time, right? And most of them write down their members, right? And computers love data. So start feeding it that data and start saying, hey, if you see any of these organizations on their resumes, okay, give them a +1, right? The AI is going to do what you tell it. It's just going to do it faster. Right? That's basically what AI is good as, is absorbing ridiculous amounts of data faster than you could if you have to do it on your own, but it's going to absorb it how you tell it to. So I think that would be like one of my first suggestions is just put your thumb on the scale in favor of justice, basically.
I love that. I'm going to get to a couple of attendee questions. So Marl T asked, that's for us. Shreya N asked, for the red versus blue example, how do we take into consideration group dynamics? And she said, example, polarization, loafing, conformity to combat bias. And then she also added, this is such an interesting talk.
Well, thank you. There's several ways to do that, right? And to in fact be very salesy. The whole middle chapter of my book sort of gets into some of the things around group dynamics and how to avoid those biases. One of the things that's really good for basically if you have a shouter, right, the person who kind of takes over the conversation, there's an approach called 8-up if you're trying to generate an idea. So you have a question on the table like, how might we do a better job of moving people around? And what you do is you get 8 people in a room, preferably diverse, and you say, okay, each one of you write down 3 ideas how we might do a better job of moving people around. And then you say, okay, y'all got your 3 ideas? Great. You show your 3 ideas to your neighbor. They're going to show their 3 ideas to you. You got 10 minutes. Take those 6 ideas, whittle them down to 2. So now you have all these pairs of people talking. When it's over, you have pairs of people who each have 2 ideas. Great. Pair number 1, show your 2 ideas to pair number 2. Pair number 2, show your 2 ideas to pair number 1. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 2, right? And you keep doing this until you basically have 8 people taking 4 ideas and whittling them down to 1. And what's nice about this, if you have weird group dynamics, is they don't really get to come into play until the very end. Like if you got that one loud dude, that's always a dude. If that one loud dude, right, he doesn't really get to bother anybody in the first round. He can only bother one person in the second round, right? And his message is diluted throughout. This approach has lots of other advantages in that everybody's DNA ends up in the final idea. But for that group dynamic aspect, like taking that progressive approach, rather than saying, hey, everybody shout at once, it's like, no, let's control that a little bit. Let's slowly bleed all your ideas together and then come to a conclusion. So that's one approach, I think, if you're worried about group dynamics for stuff like this.
And does anybody on the leadership, anybody have a question or anybody here? Oh, so Shreya says, wow, so insightful.
Well, first I wanted to say that yes, to answer the question that people have had in the chat, we are recording this and we will send this out afterward. But I know a question that comes up a lot in Black UX Austin is about being the only, right? So you talk a lot about, and I took some screenshots from myself, when you're looking at the identities that are represented in your team, and then you look at what's not represented, and how that absence of that would be, would influence sort of the design or the experience. When you're the only, right? And like in this group, a lot of us end up being the only on a team, and then you're already trying to advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
And then you got to advocate for something that, because maybe you have better lens, right? Because you see yourself as being the only, about what's missing. How do you do that, right? How do you advocate in that way? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I feel like that is one of those, whenever I answer a question like that, I always try to be very sensitive to power, right? Because it's not just, are you the only, but also how long have you been there? How secure are you in your job? How many friends do you have on leadership? Who's got your back if someone gets angry at you, right? All those are very important questions to answer before you decide exactly how you're going to advocate for yourself or how you're going to advocate for others. is my car paid off, right? Like there's a lot like serious questions you have to ask yourself. And as folks of color, we know that. Like it's just a survival skill you build up over time. So any advice I give in this area, answer those questions first, right? Because if you're in a position where it's like, I need this job to stay in this country, maybe you need to shut the fuck up, right? And it's not because it's not the right thing to do, but it's because like, look, you got to get your own oxygen first before you can give your oxygen to your friend. So with that caveat, though, I would say what you hope for, right, is that simply by having to answer the question, you watch and see what the other people who don't look like you in the room, do they notice, right? Because the nice thing about the approach is that people tend to answer the question they're asked, right? It's just an instinct. If I say, what color don't you see behind me? It's not going to take very long for you to start being like, oh, I don't really see green. I don't really see purple. You're going to get there, right? If I'm going to see, well, what 2 colors do you see immediately, right? Okay, that's also going to pop in, right? Like it's really like our brains are wired to just answer questions. So hopefully you get at least a little bit of leeway just out of the fact that if I ask my all-white team, hey, who's not in this room? And the only other person there's a black guy, they might say, there's someone Asian here. I never noticed that, but you know what? There isn't. Like you can't help it. Like your mind just looks to how to answer that thing. So hopefully that you or me, if I'm in the room, the sole black person in the room doesn't actually have to do a lot of that pointing out. Hopefully just the human brain, the human lizard brain is just going to start to get those things. Now, if you don't, that's when you have to start taking notes. And that's why look, I've been in 3 of these assumption audits. And again, this is all dependent on, do you have an ally? Do you have someone you can talk to about this, right? I've been in 3 of these assumption audits so far, and no one has brought up that there are no women in that room. I don't even understand how that's happened, but isn't that weird? Is there any, if there's anyone in the office to whom you can go and say, isn't that weird, right? That's what you do. And the reason I bring that up is because the assumption audit can be a very frustrating process, because even if you have the most diverse team in the room, and you discover, we're missing this important factor, because of the way of economics and how our jobs tend to work, you might not be able to do anything about that. Like you might not be able to a way to find to include honor and give power to folks in that process. And that can be very frustrating. So what I always say is write that stuff down, right? So that after the 3rd or 4th assumption audit, you can actually have something to say, look, I just went through this diversity training and we're saying we care about these things. I got to tell you, we just did 3 of these things and there are no Asians on any of the last projects that we've done, and we've never talked to them. And I can guarantee you Asians use our product, So those are the kinds of things that I think you can sort of, again, with the caveat of protect your neck, right? That you can do to sort of like advocate for others. Basically, it's a little jujitsu to get them to do the advocating, right? Rather than taking on the sole responsibility yourself. Because you're right, you've already got a lot on your plate.
I like that answer. Get them to do all the work of advocating. You just plant the seed, the question, into their head.
I like that too. We have another question from Kira, and she asked, have you found any differences in how cognitive biases manifest themselves in person work settings versus remote work settings? Any learnings we can take from a remote setting into an in-person setting?
That's a really interesting question. One thing that I would love to take advantage of is the fact that when you are in this kind of a setting, this is like an app I want to build. I want something that records how much time I spend talking versus how much time you spend talking versus how much time you spend talking, right? That's pretty hard to do in the real world, but something like this, like how long is this little yellow blocks lit up for me versus you? Like a computer knows how to do that. And then come back later and be like, the dudes in these meetings talk 90% of the time. That's interesting. And then honestly, I didn't want to build the part of the app that's like only gives everyone, if there's 6 people in the meeting, everyone only gets 10 minutes. And as soon as they've spoken for 10 minutes, it cuts off their mic, right? And like, there's an opportunity to really shape the dynamic, because a lot of psychology is the stuff we don't notice. And when you make the stuff that you don't notice visible, people react really differently, right? And I don't know if that doesn't really answer the question, but it's sort of like more because honestly, I don't see that much difference in how the dynamics play out, whether it's an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting. I think it gets weirder because we're not used to, if you were in a real world meeting, you couldn't see yourself. I'm used now to seeing myself when I have meetings. I'm wondering if and when we get back to the real world and I'm in a normal meeting again, I'll be like, wait, I can't see myself. Something's wrong. Let me get out a mirror, you know? I think that's definitely doing something weird to us, but I don't know what yet. But I honestly don't see that much difference. I think what's really different and really interesting is that I think it's playing with how much of ourselves we're allowed to bring to work. So even this right now, right? I'm just wearing a t-shirt, and frankly, I always wear t-shirts to presentations. It's not that different for me, but the way that we're showing up at work and what's considered professional and what you're sort of, how human you're allowed to be, I feel like that's been getting really weird lately, like in a good way. I feel like in the workplace environment, we are basically coded to be very male and very white, to be honest. This very conservative, like, don't show your feelings. There's a certain sense of humor that's sort of acceptable. There's a certain, level of competitiveness that's expected. There's just this very kind of male aggro European behavior that's kind of like, and anything that's like more showing emotion, showing that you care about somebody, supporting somebody, listening to talking about feelings, which are coded more feminine, are considered weak. And I feel like a lot of that is getting messed with online now because there's no way around the fact that you're sitting in your bedroom. Come on. There's no way to get around the fact that a cat is going to move across the screen during this meeting. Like, it's not even a Zoom meeting until a cat goes across. Like, your kid's going to walk in. It's going to, like, the pretense falls away. Like, you can't pretend that you're not an employee, you're a human, because you're surrounded by human things and you're seeing human things every day now in work meetings. And like, I love that facade is starting to crack. I'm very curious to see if that makes us be more human when we actually get into the office again. I don't know. But that's actually the big difference I've been noticing. All the typical biases, like the self-serving bias I told you about, where if something works, it's my fault, and if it doesn't, it's your fault. Like all that stuff's still the same. That hasn't gone anywhere. But the literally seeing our coworkers' workplaces is just different. It's fundamentally different. And I feel like it's opening up that, and the fact that this isn't universal, that and the fact that like a lot of times you'll get on meetings and something horrible has happened 2 days prior. And people are getting better. They're not all there yet, but people are getting better about being like, look, are you okay? Right? Like, how many times this year in 2020, were you asked the question, how are you? Just as casually. And you're like, I have no clue how to answer that. Like, you have to make a choice. Do I answer honestly? Or do I just sort of like go with the flow? Or how many times have you just instinctively asked, hey, how you doing? And being like, oh, that is the dumbest question I've ever asked. Right? But that's new. That didn't used to happen. So I know that's a long answer, but that's kind of like how I see the differences now that we're doing all this from our homes.
Yeah, that's true. I do hope that when we take that humanity back with us into the office, into the workspace, because I think that would change a lot, especially when you're working in tech companies with predominantly white males and, and that kind of atmosphere. So another question we have from Arlin, and her question is, what's been your hardest struggle in evangelizing cognitive bias? And how do non-designers help designers do that work?
That's a good question. So it's funny. This has not been an especially difficult gospel to preach, to be honest. And I think part of the reason is I've been preaching to a lot of the converted. Like, honestly, I've been talking to a lot of folks who are already who are already frustrated with the state of tech. To be honest, I'm starting to talk more at corporations that are being blamed for some of the world's ills. And it's going to be interesting to see how they take that message. So we'll see, I guess, is the answer. But I find the trickier thing now for me is helping understand the difference, not trying to sell myself as a DEI expert, because what I think a lot of people are looking for right now, either legitimately or just cosmetically, is someone to give them a rubber stamp of we're diverse, we're woke, leave us alone. And they look to me for that. I'm like, I can't do that for you. And even if you're looking for the legit DEI work, like that HR work, like there are people who professionally do that. I know them. I can give you their numbers. They're great at this, but I'm talking about like cognitive bias, and specifically cognitive bias in design and your products. But weirdly, I haven't gotten a lot of resistance to just that core message. Now, I think when it comes to actually spending money on it, that's where I've run into trouble, right? And again, I haven't done a lot of like on the ground, I'm going to come in and do a red team for you work. But where I have, that's actually me giving a talk is easy. People are fine and I get great feedback. Doing a workshop, I do inclusive design workshops. Generally, I get good feedback on that. And actually, when I get negative feedback, it's around the space that I'm trying to create may not have felt safe enough for some of the people taking part. So it's not the big corporate bigwigs who have a problem. It's really the people who are probably the only person in the room, and they want to make sure they're safe before they start spouting off about inclusive design, right? So again, not really corporate pushback there. So the only what you're probably thinking of when you think of pushback to this message is at the level of, oh, I want you to actually spend money now on doing this red team exercise, or I want you to actually spend money now on doing this piece or that piece. That's where I'm just starting to get resistance. But I got to say, I haven't gotten a lot of resistance. And honestly, part of that is probably 2020. Like, people were probably in a position, I'm going to be real here with you. When summer happened and all the black folks at my work got in the little Slack, right, where all the black folks hide, you know what I'm talking about? There was a
hashtag black.
There was a sentiment of, like, to be perfectly blunt, there's a sentiment of like, okay, Black Christmas, like, if you want to ask for something, do it right now. Like, this is the moment where they cannot say no. And, you know, just between us chickens, like, we now have Juneteenth as a holiday, as a work holiday. And we now have MLK as a day of service. We didn't have that before. And I can tell you right now, if we didn't ask for it, they wouldn't have given it. So I forget why I was telling you that story.
Answer the question about pushback.
Because yeah, that's part of the reason I think I'm not getting that much resistance, is because it's not politically correct to give me resistance right now.
I'm going to tag onto this because one of the questions that I had, and that you started to touch on it, is the workshops, like, and doing these at those larger corporations, those places that are where it's needed the most. And what's that been like? And
that's been remarkably good. Like, that was I've been thinking about this for a while. And when I wrote the book is actually structured in a way that lends itself to that. In fact, it's funny, I remember this now. The original draft of the book, at the end of every chapter, there was a bunch of exercises to do. And in the end, that just didn't really fit, but it was already kind of structured like a workshop. So I did one for this tech event in Philly like 2 years ago, where I just basically took the talk I just gave you and turned it and made it more exercisey, right? And we did exercises for these different parts, including the Black Mirror exercise, which was really fun. And it worked pretty well. And it's like, okay, well, let's turn this into a real product. So I work at Think Company, and I do like talks of my own, but like, I'm part-time at Think Company. And when we actually offer these inclusive design workshops, and we've done them now for like, well, I can explicitly tell you, we did them for Turo, which is a peer-to-peer car sharing service based in California, but it's worldwide. And they loved it, right? Like, I can tell you about it because they actually wrote a testimonial for us. But we've done them at a couple other places now. We've got a couple more lined up, and we're giving them at like bigger and bigger companies every time. And part of the thing to keep in mind is these are like isolated teams of like 20 people, usually a little bit of UX, usually a little bit of product management. So it's not like I'm talking to the CEO and saying, "Oh, you're bad." You know, it's folks who are already looking and probably trying to advocate for a better way of life. But yeah, they've loved it. Like, it's the response. Like I said, I've been really encouraged by how positive the response has been, and how I'm just starting to see. So, you know, I work in an experienced design firm, so we're vetting SOWs that come in and requests for proposal that come in that say, hey, we want to know about this and that about your company. And I'm just starting to get now folks who are saying, well, look, tell us about your inclusive design practices. Like, this is a new project for us and we want to do it right. How do you, and I can actually put things like a red team in the SOW. Like, I thought it was going to be like 2 years before I could do something like that. But it's like not a lot, but I'm getting one or two folks who are like, yeah, tell us about, that is going to make or break this proposal for you to get our work, is like, can you actually walk the walk? So I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's 2020. I don't know what's going on, but I'm heartened to see that people are in fact at least trying to spend money on this stuff.
Yeah, that warms my heart too. I hope that continues. May that continue. So we have another question. So Kashif asks, in Ruined by Design by Mike Montero mentions, the value of designs having ethical standards and requirements that we should abide by. Do you see a value in designers being required to acquire an ethical credentialing or credentials? Or do you have a set of values that you live by in addition?
Both, right? So it's funny, like I've talked to Mike. That's one of the first conversations Mike and I ever had. Mike's a friend of mine. I actually just did a blurb. He has a new book out, by the way, if you want to read it. It was my first book blurb. It was kind of fun. So Mike and I have had lots of discussions about this. And what I 100% get and agree with the idea that he basically said, he's talking about licensing, right? You should have, if you need a license to fish, right? And that's not going to kill anybody. You damn well need a license to like design because, you're going to be helping design the interface for a car that might kill somebody or for, there's all sorts of ways that design can kill you. So like, and I get that and I agree with it. And then what I always come back at him with though is who is doing the licensing? And he agrees with me on this. Like licensing is a fantastic way to subjugate people. Licensing is a fantastic way to say that folks who look like me and you never get licenses, right? Or that, it's funny, we've had licensing for a year now and 90% of the people with licenses are white males. Funny how that happens. Wait, who's doing the licensing? Oh, white males. Huh. I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right? Like, and I've been thinking about this. I would love to see an approach to that basically says, we're going to do licensing, but only the people who have been the victims of design are going to be the ones who construct the rules for the licensing and hand out the licenses. Like if you have not been hurt by design, I don't want you handing out the license, right? Like that to me is an approach that might be more equitable because I agree, like this isn't that different from any other group of people who do things that affect society. Doctors do things that affect society. Lawyers do things that affect society. And I do not want to work with a doctor who isn't licensed. I do not want to work with a lawyer who isn't licensed. I just don't, right? So I think it's worth figuring out, but I want that project in the hands of the people who have been hurt by design, not in the hands of the people who have profited from design.
I love that. And I hope that we all as a community come together to make that happen. Because you're right, like there should be more accountability because it can be so dangerous. There is it can cause harm. It has caused harm. So Carmen asked this question, and it was a question I had too. What companies do you think are starting to really think about cognitive bias and do the work? And are there companies now that you see where they're like actively thinking about it and seeing a difference in the kinds of products that they produce?
So a couple of companies come to mind. So LinkedIn actually does red team, blue team. Like that's one of the folks I actually learned about from them. So they're using. I know Airbnb has an inclusive design shop. Like that's a function now at Airbnb. So better late than never, I suppose. But and in terms of really. So Europe is a little more ahead of this than we are in terms of like actually including behavioral scientists on design teams. Because one of the things you have to start to think about is who should be on a design team, right? Like it's one thing to say, hey, there are all these biases that affect designers. And it's another thing to say, hey, designer, I know you've already spent God knows how much money on school. I want you to go back and learn social science. So why not just get a social scientist, right? And so Dan Ariely out at, I think he's at UNC maybe, is doing a lot of work with that. So he produced, I'm going to blank on the name of it, but he produced an actual digital product. It's a scale. But instead of giving you a number, it works differently. It's based on behavioral design around basically if you're trying to lose weight and you're looking at a number every day, it's going to be horrible for you. Like that's not a great way to motivate yourself. So it has a different like interface that actually, the science has shown is a better way to motivate you. I forget what it's called, but if you look up Dan Ariely and I don't know, scale, it'll show up. But he's an actual behavioral economist. He wrote Predictably Irrational. It's one of the books that I read that got me into cognitive bias. But that's one of the first instances I've seen of someone literally putting an understanding of cognitive bias at the core of product design. I think he's doing that with like some other product he's building. But so that is a little more common and accepted in Europe, as I understand it, in terms of like, oh yeah, you should have a behavioral scientist on your design team. It's fairly new here, but there's a handful of companies that are like literally the core concept is we need to make behavioral design a part of the design team.
I love that. I hope that we start to see that happen more here because it's needed and necessary, particularly because this is where so many of these products are being built and at such a rapid rate, right?
Yeah. And I just want to add real quick, like going back to education, we have a friend in Sweden. In Sweden, if you want to learn UX, you spend 2 years first learning social science. Then you decide if you want to do applied social science, which is UX, or do you want to just become an academic and do research? But to them, why would you learn UX without first learning social science? Like to them, it's connected.
That's incredible. I did not know that. Thank you for telling me and sharing that. It's something to start to recommend to folks in creating academic programs that sort of reach out to those of us in the field and ask about, like, what should be included? Well, why don't you include some social science courses? We are coming to the end of this amazing time together and this amazing talk. David, thank you so much for coming and talking with us and sharing and enlightening us. I hope that folks, please, I encourage you, please, to find his book and to read it. It is an eye-opener. Please follow him on social media, reach out.
And just real quick, I'm dropping my website in the chat. So if anyone wants to reach out, wants to learn more about the workshops, all that good stuff's in there if you want to follow up.
Awesome. Thank you. And we will include that in the email, the follow-up email that we send out with everyone that attended tonight with a link to the video. We did do our raffle, and I'd like to announce we have 2 raffle winners. One is still on the call. Marley Z, you are one of tonight's winners. Yay! We ask that you please stay on the call so we can get your info to be able to send your book out to you. Yay! And I wanted to thank everyone again. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I love having these events and having this space where we get to have these conversations about things that are impacting our lives, our everyday world, and the things that we all think about all the time. And David, you help to put things in such an eloquent manner so that it helps us when we go out into the world to be able to, have the right language to talk about that. So thank everyone again tonight so much. And we also yes, please, everyone remember to take a moment and fill out the 1-minute survey that we'll be sending out to you. And thanks again. And I hope everyone stays safe and sane and find some time for self-care because that's so important. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
Night.
Thanks, David. Night.